Look what the cat dragged in. And here it is, the Accelsior 4M2 PCI Express SSD from OWC. This particular one has 4 1TB M.2 NVMe SSDs inside, which together in RAID 0 create 4TB usable as advertised. It is a very well built card with a massive but really nice and pretty heatsink on top. And the best part is I actually got 4 of these guys, so we will test configurations with 1, 2, 3 and 4 of them in RAID so that you may determine which configuration works best for your use case scenario. So I will pop this Mac Pro cover off and go through a sped up video of how I actually got them installed. Listen to this. So this is the first card going in, and to put them in I like to actually touch the PCI connectors with my fingers, because this way I can touch the PCI slot and the connectors and align the card instantly without fail the first time around. Next in, card number 2, then card number 3, and finally number 4. As soon as I was done, however, I decided to pop this card and move it all the way to the bottom. This way I have a nice symmetrical design and also much better cooling. One thing I found out was that the cards are really wiggly inside their slots. The Apple retaining mechanism is really not holding them, especially the very bottom one and the top one. So with all that out of the way, let's jump into benchmarks. The very first thing we want to do in the SoftRAID software here is to create a new volume, and let's just immediately test a RAID 0 configuration utilizing all 16 drives. So I'm going to select all of them, choose the volume type to be RAID 0, and we will want it optimized for digital video, which actually sets our stripe unit size to 128 kilobytes, which is great for video and uncompressed audio and things like that. It takes SoftRAID only 20 to 30 seconds to actually create this 15.4 terabyte usable volume for us. And as soon as it's ready, let's jump into Blackmagic's disk speed test, pick our new drive and start the test. And here are the first results. 7.7 gigabytes per second writes and about 10 gigabytes per second reads. Definitely not something to laugh at. It is phenomenal performance, about 2 times more write speed than Apple's internal SSDs and about 3 times more read speed than Apple's internal SSDs. So this is really nice. However, I'll show you later on that these drives, because there is actually 16 of them, can even do a little bit better than this. I'll show you how. Before we go into benchmarks, let's do a couple more things. Here is a single M.2 NVMe SSD drive sitting in a PCI Express slot in my Mac Pro. And as you can see, their reads and writes are about identical and they're about 2800 megabytes per second. This is what's to be expected from a single M.2 drive. And for the last quick comparison, let's select the Apple's internal SSD. I'll just pick my downloads folder here and see what it can do. And as expected, it does about 3 gigabytes per second writes, and mine does a little bit less than 3 gigabytes per second reads, and that's just because it is over 70% full. So it used to do about 3 gigabytes per second reads as well, and it went down a little bit since I started filling it up. So in the same fashion, I continued doing all of these tests and trying every different type of RAID configuration between 4 different cards that I have and 16 different SSDs that are actually in this system. And the ultimate outcome, without taking you through actually every single one of these tests so that you can see for yourself, is actually this spreadsheet. This spreadsheet actually has the numbers for 23 different RAID configurations I tested with 4 of these PCI Express cards. The lowest common denominator here is not a single PCI Express card, rather a single 1 terabyte SSD on each of these cards. Combining these 1 terabyte SSDs in different RAID configurations in different quantities, striping them across cards or having them within a single card is what all of these results are actually from. As a baseline, we have the very first row in the top of the table, and that is the read and write speed of a single 1 terabyte SSD, which comes to be about 2.8 gigabytes per second for reads and writes. I will not read every single one of these results. However, of note should be the last 4 test results in here, which show you the speed in RAID 0 if you had 2, 3, or 4 of these PCI Express cards put together. The best speed as expected is when using 4 of these cards together, where we are getting about 10 gigabyte read speeds and about 8 gigabytes per second in writes. The second battery of benchmarks is for RAID 1 configuration. In RAID 1, we are mirroring 2 particular drives, so this particular benchmark only shows us the speeds of combining 2 different drives in different ways. There are only 3 ways we can really combine them, and that was to use 2 drives on a single card, the ones that are next to each other, 2 drives on a single card that are not necessarily next to each other, so staggered, and 2 1 terabyte drives on 2 different cards, so 1 terabyte from one card and 1 terabyte drive from the other card. An interesting result here is that 2 1 terabyte drives within the same card, if those drives are next to one another, will give you about 2 gigabytes per second read speed total. However, if you use the staggered drives in a card, so use a drive 1 and 3 and a 2 and 4 in a RAID 1 configuration, you will actually get double the read performance, which was very interesting. However, as you can see by the stars in the results, this means that those particular ones had very inconsistent performance, and I would actually not recommend doing a RAID 1 within the card itself. If you want a RAID 1 that is actually reliable as well as fast, probably the best would be to use the 2 drives that are on different PCI Express cards. In the next group of benchmarks, I was trying to test the RAID 5 performance. If you're looking into RAID 5, it's probably because you want protection, and in that case, I would highly recommend doing nothing more than a single PCI Express card and RAID 5 over the 4 integrated M.2 SSDs. In my opinion, this is the only setup you will actually be able to restore from in a case of an SSD failure, because out of those 4 drives, one will be bad and you will be able to determine which one. However, if you're trying to do a RAID 5 across multiple cards, like 2, 3, or 4 of them, where you're having 8, 12, or 16 1 terabyte SSDs inside, while it is a RAID 5 and there is protection, trying to figure out which one of these SSDs is actually bad will be nearly impossible. Any and all configurations of a RAID 5 will give you about the same read performance, which is about 1 gigabytes per second. However, the write performance will actually go up by about 2, 3, or 4 gigabytes per second the more PCI Express cards you add. Once again, I would stress, if you want RAID 5 configuration, do not spread it across more than one single PCI Express card. And the very last group of tests shows us the performance of a RAID 10 configuration. In the top table are the results for using RAID 10 across 4 SSDs, and I did them in 2 different ways. The first 2 results are by using RAID 10 in a single PCI Express card across the 4 SSDs that are in it. And when you're doing RAID 10, you actually have to choose the primary drives. And the first test is choosing the first 2 drives as primaries, and the second test is choosing them in a staggered fashion, the drives 1 and 3 as the primaries for the RAID 10. And the results are actually a little bit better performance on reads and writes if you use staggered configuration. In the very last test on the top table, I actually used 2 drives from one PCI Express card and 2 drives from the other one. This is actually the best setup you can have, and as you can see, it gives you the best read and write performance. So for a RAID 10, read of about 3.8 gigabytes per second and a write of about 5.7 is actually quite acceptable and really nice. The reason why I also prefer the third option best is because you're actually splitting RAID 10 the way it should be. You're putting the primary drives of it in one card and the secondary drives of it in another card. This way, even in the case of losing a whole PCI Express card or the whole Accelsior 4M2 drive, you will have the other one to take over. In the second table, we're testing the RAID 10 performance across 2, 3, or 4 PCI Express cards, and that's using 8, 12, or 16 drives total. However, the only RAID 10 setup I would recommend would be the very first one of using 2 PCI cards maximum. When you do a RAID 10, you actually need half of your drives to be primary, and half of them will act as a mirror or a secondary. Only when using 2 PCI cards is when you can actually split them properly so that half of the drives are in one card and half of the drives are in the other, protecting you not only from a failure of a single M.2 SSD, but also from the whole card itself. While the other two options of 12 and 16 drives or utilizing 3 and 4 PCI cards would also work, I would not recommend them because they introduce a single point of failure, which is a PCI Express card. If any one of those cards fails, you would probably lose the whole array. So in summary, if you want the best performance, you have to use RAID 0, of course, and a single card will do close to 6 GB per second on reads and writes. Adding 2, 3, or 4 cards and striping across all of them will increase that tremendously, all the way up to 4 cards with 10 GB per second reads and about 8 GB per second writes. If, however, you're looking to protect your data in some way while still getting the best performance, the next setup I would recommend would be the RAID 10 configuration. From all of the possible RAID 10 configurations, I would highly recommend using the one right in the middle here marked in green. That one uses 2 PCI cards, and your primary drives will all be in one PCI card, where all of your secondary drives from RAID 10 mirror would be in the second card itself. In this case, not only will you be protected from using individual M.2 drives, but also losing a complete PCI Express card itself. I marked here the fastest RAID 10 option as well. However, I would recommend not using this because it would be near impossible to figure out which one of your individual 1 TB drives has failed in case that occurs. So after watching all of this, you can probably guess that the fastest way to run these cards is actually to use each individual PCI card by itself in a RAID 0 configuration. So as an experiment, if you actually have 4 of these PCI Express cards and you stripe them in RAID 0, you're looking into 10 GB per second reads and 8 GB per second writes. But if you use these cards individually and put your media into one of them and use the other one as a scratch disk and the third one maybe as whatever else you want it to be, you will get the maximum throughput of all of these individual cards. So as you can see here, I'm running the disk speed test from Blackmagic on all 4 cards at the same time. And I try to time them so that we are hitting the writes at about the same time and reads at about the same time. And we can almost maximize the throughput. So we're looking at about 16 GB per second or more writes and 15 to 20 GB per second reads. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope it's useful to someone in either figuring out which RAID config you should actually be running or how many of these drives you actually need. My personal opinion about OWC's Accelsior cards is that they're really amazing. I would love to see a 4 TB card that does not have 4 1 TB M.2 SSDs, rather just a 4 TB worth of storage on one card, but we are not there yet. Well, if you got all the way to this very end, thank you very much for watching. Please hit that like and a subscribe button. It would mean very much to me. Thanks. Bye.